From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams.
Good evening. Human Rights Watch now says 297 people have been killed in the fight for control of the streets, which is really a fight for the future of Egypt. While it's important for the protesters to keep up momentum, to stay angry, hold the world's attention, today both sides appeared to be in their own stalemate. The protesters have turned the main square into a quasi-permanent community, a village. And President Hosni Mubarak, despite everything being said about him, is still there, still in office, in his job as president. We begin our coverage tonight once again with NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel in Cairo. Hey, Richard, good evening.
Good evening, Brian. This is now a standoff over power, trust, and pride. President Mubarak says he will not step down under pressure, and the protests say they won't go until he does.
Tahrir Square is now a camp city. It's more like a sit-in than last week's violent revolution. The army's protective cordon remains around the square, but protesters worry the military will push them out. So they've formed a human shield around the tanks to stop an advance.
We stay here to defend our revolution. We will stay here and sleep under this tank until Mubarak get out.
These protesters fought to take this square. Today they held a mock funeral here for one of their martyrs. They won't give it up easily. At an aid station, volunteer doctors and nurses still treat the wounded, averaging one every 5 minutes. In a tent, a group of men offer me breakfast. Everyone shares here. They're united by a single goal. We won't leave unless Mubarak leaves. Enough of the oppression, he said. While protesters are ready for a long standoff, the government is trying to undercut them by promising to implement nearly everything they've asked for. Yesterday, the new vice president met opposition groups, including the Muslim Brotherhood, which supports Islamic law. The government said it would eventually lift a decades-old martial law, allow more press freedom, and make elections democratic. But can the government be believed? And then there's President Mubarak. The government says he'll stay until the fall to finish out his term with dignity. But the biggest change in Cairo now is cars are out. Banks are open. The government announced today state employees will even receive 15% raises. That's raises for 5 million people.
Across Cairo, the city is starting to open up, but there's also a frustration here that the last 2 weeks of chaos have disrupted this country's economy, and a feeling that the protests have gone on long enough.
In the main bazaar, Baha Sayed opened his small store today, but only dusts off the souvenirs. No tourists, no business. Egyptians are now divided, with many wanting democracy, but not unrest. In the square, the protesters say Egyptians shouldn't give up yet and must keep the pressure on, or risk losing their revolution.
The protesters tell us they're not stubborn, but they are skeptical because President Mubarak has made promises to do many of these reforms before, but not carry them out, Brian.
Amazing to see the stores open. That's a start. They were all shuttered up when we were there last week. Richard Engel in Cairo starting off our coverage again tonight. Richard, thanks. And this so-called People's Revolution in Cairo was coming for some time. Its roots are in years of social discontent in Egypt, including high unemployment and a whole lot of educated young people just out of college with zero prospect for a job. It was helped along by neighboring Tunisia, and it got a push from social media, as we saw while we were there. And some of those who had put the word out are now a part of the story. We're going to be looking closely this week at the roots of the rage and revolution in Egypt, beginning tonight with NBC's Ron Allen in Cairo.
After 12 days of police detention, Wael Ghonim is a free man. I am fine, he said, and God willing, we will change our country. The release of the 30-year-old Google executive and online activist gave protesters another reason to celebrate. He first became a hero last June when he and others launched Facebook pages condemning the death of a young man allegedly beaten to death by police. Protests back then against chronic unemployment, oppression, and corruption led to the demonstrations now filling Cairo's main square. And in a country without a free press or free speech, activists insist new media helped get the word out.
Facebook and Twitter were kind of like the tool that got people organized.
Meet Mahmoud Salem, Egyptian digital media businessman and a graduate of Northeastern University in Boston. Online, he calls himself Sand Monkey, a name intended, he says, to poke fun at political correctness.
I had to come out as, my real name and my real face, because if we don't stand up, then there's no point to this whole revolution.
He's connected with nearly 20,000 followers. As the protests began, the revolt continues. Egypt won't stop, won't give in. And just this weekend, start registering the protesters, get their names, addresses, and districts. Start organizing them into committees. In the crowds, young people like Labna Akrab say social media helped them understand what was really going on.
Twitter and Facebook gave people a chance to see the real picture, to see the hurt, the injured people.
A new weapon in an old fight, helping Egyptians do battle against an oppressive regime. Ron Allen, NBC News, Cairo.
And back here again today, the White House was walking that fine line in responding to this crisis in Egypt. Our chief White House correspondent, Chuck Todd, following that part of the story. Chuck, good evening.
Good evening, Brian. Well, the Obama administration is in what it's calling phase 2 of this new Egyptian policy. Phase 1 was to push Mubarak to not seek re-election and to start the process of getting out of power. Phase 2 is about getting this reform process to become something that is more credible to the Egyptian people. Here's how Robert Gibbs described that process at today's press briefing.
This is about a process. It's not about a personality. And it is important that the people see progress toward that meaningful change, just as it is important that those in the opposition take part in this process and put forward what they want to see come out of this.
The bottom line, Brian, is that their efforts to keep pushing Mubarak have sort of been tabled a little bit, as they want to empower in many ways the Vice President Suleiman and get him to do the reforms that he has promised to do, to keep doing these meetings with these opposition leaders. In many ways, as one person joked with me, it's kind of like Mubarak is junior soprano. He's still there. They know he's going to be there for a while. They don't think they can push him out the door in the near term, and so instead work with Suleiman.
One way of describing it. Chuck Todd at the White House tonight as the diplomacy goes on. Chuck, thanks. And tonight we want to bring you up to date on the 76-year-old American woman named Mary Thornberry, whose story we've been following here. After we learned she was trapped and defending herself from thugs inside her Cairo apartment right off the main square, after we made contact with her and broadcast the phone conversation, the wheels started moving. She was safely rescued, and today she was with us here in New York and back on American soil.
Well, hallelujah.
Mary Thornberry finally back in the United States and greeted by her son Philip yesterday, and today we finally got to meet. You have a huge fan base now. It's just been unbelievable.
That's what I gather.
We first heard about Mary via an email from her son saying his mother needed help. And then last Wednesday, at the height of the violence in Cairo, we were able to reach her by phone. How worried are you about your safety?
I have a sharp knife. I have hot water. I have my walking cane, and I have my rolling pin.
Today we learned more about that knife, and we learned Mary wasn't messing around.
That first night, about every 3 to 5 minutes, someone would be at my door.
Oh.
And there would sometimes there'd be 4 or 5 faces.
Oh my goodness.
In this place, and that's when I would be going with my hot water and my knife. And this knife is not a kitchen knife. This knife is a knife, the blade about so long, and with a hand grip handle.
Yep.
And it had a lanyard that I would keep wrapped around my wrist. And when they would stop at my door for a moment, I'd go back to my lazy boy, and I'd be holding still the knife in my hand.
That was a serious knife intended for one purpose.
Yes.
And don't make me use it became your motto.
That's right.
Last Thursday, Lester Holt set out on foot in Cairo to find Mary's apartment, though had to turn back because the streets weren't yet safe.
And that's the area where we think Mary's apartment is.
Yeah, they've set a car on fire on the overpass where the tank was.
The rock throwing, the Molotov cocktails.
From my roof?
From your roof. That was a Molotov cocktail factory they were running up there.
Apparently so. And there was a fire up there on the roof.
I saw it burn.
There may have been another one out, but at least one.
Mary's son Philip is a social studies teacher back home in Washington State. He had just taught his students about Egypt. Suddenly, his mother on the telephone was part of the story.
When I called her, I could actually hear the voices of some of the guys at the door, you know, banging on the door, that kind of thing, and a little bit in Arabic and everything. And so I knew it was a serious situation and not just her imagination or anything.
After all she's been through, not knowing when or if she will return, Mary misses her adopted home in Egypt. You clearly love the place, though.
Yes, I do.
What an unbelievable story. Sadly, Mary does not expect to see any of her possessions again. Her rolling pin, her knife, her piano, none of it. Though she's asked some of the friendly protesters to keep an eye on her apartment, she fears looters nonetheless will clean her out. She says she's always planned to be buried in Egypt because of her love for the people, the history, the archaeology. She says she will not return, however, as a single woman if Egypt becomes some sort of Islamic state.